If our world is the product of a benevolent creator who has a crucial message to communicate to his creation, then why is religious confusion and disorientation so pervasive? Would we really expect a world that has this amount of religious disarray to be the product of a clear divine communicator? In this video, we survey what I take to be one of the most formidable arguments against the existence of the Christian God, the problem of religious confusion. Suppose for a moment that I had a message for the members of my family, let's say my immediate as well as my extended family, and not just any message, but a message so crucial, so vital, and of such existential gravity that their well-being and their lives themselves rest upon sufficiently receiving the message. Now imagine further that, despite the fact that I could unambiguously transmit this message in person, I instead decide to propagate this message through a written medium, say a letter. And yet, because of the obscurity that a written transmission invites, let us suppose that upon receiving my letter, confusion abounds. Some members of my family believe I wrote the letter, but arrive at different interpretations of what exactly I mean and precisely what needs to be done for them to salvage their lives. Other members of my family don't even believe that I wrote the letter and instead identify a different letter written by someone else completely as the product of my pen. And yet still, a last few members of my family don't believe I penned a letter at all. They don't even believe I have a message for them in the first place. Now, keep in mind that in this analogy, I have indeed authored a letter, and I wrote this letter in a desperate attempt to communicate and elucidate an important message. Given this scenario as described, what might be a most reasonable inference? Would it not be that, number one, I am not an optimal communicator, and number two, that I have not done what's necessary to guarantee that my message has been sufficiently received? Even if one wants to lay the confusion at the feet of my family members, which I think would be misplaced but possible nonetheless, couldn't this situation still have been avoided completely if I had taken the necessary steps to ensure that the potential for confusion was reduced as much as possible? Surely, this is reasonable. The parallel between this analogy and the Christian God should be apparent. The God of Christian theism has a message for humanity, and not just any message, but a message so critical that the salvation of our eternal souls rests upon how we respond to the doctrines contained therein. And how has God, the omnipotent and omniscient creator, decided to propagate his precious divine message? Well, also through a written medium, a book in this case, known as the Bible. The Bible, as Christians conceive of it, is God's unique and divinely transmitted revelation to humanity. This is most precisely the medium through which God has communicated his nature, desires, history, doctrines, and admonitions. But here's the crucial issue. Just like the analogy with my letter, God's written word used to transmit his message also has generated prevalent confusion and interpretive diversity among those whom the message was meant for. Among Christians themselves, who believe they alone have correctly identified that a message from God was promulgated in the first place, there is widespread disagreement and confusion. Christians can't agree on exactly what tenets and doctrines should form the bedrock of God's message. The continual splintering of Christian denominations demonstrates that there is no collective and unified comprehension of exactly what compromises God's message. On top of this, centuries ago, different Christian denominations were burning other Christians at the stake over the imaginary crime of reaching a different interpretation of God's divine message. It's even worse than this, though, because Christians also fail to reach an agreement over the demarcation of what constitutes the biblical canon in the first place. The Protestant canon contains 66 books, while the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox canons contain 73 and 76 books, respectively. Thus, the demographic that actually believes the Bible is God's unique and divinely inspired revelation to humanity cannot even clearly ascertain what written works were inspired by God in the first place. And yet, this is only the tip of the iceberg of religious confusion, because Christianity itself only comprises approximately 30% of the world's population. If the Christian God has indeed authored a divine message to the world, 70% of the population seems to have missed the memo completely. Jews, Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists, to name merely a few, not to mention the thousands of religions that have existed since the dawn of human civilization, these devout religious adherents, through no fault of their own, happen to believe that God's divine message is found somewhere other than the books inspired by Yahweh. And on top of this, we have individuals like myself who are not convinced that there's a divine message to begin with. These individuals don't believe that God has authored or propagated any sort of divine message to humanity whatsoever. Thus, what we have here is quite literally a conglomeration of ubiquitous religious disorientation and confusion. If the Christian God has indeed authored and transmitted a divine message, then it seems that somewhere along the way the message has become inadequate, ineffective, and insufficient. Or perhaps it began that way. This all exemplifies the notion of irony, given that Scripture itself regards God as not the author of confusion. On the contrary, it appears to be the case that this is exactly what God is the author of. Now recall that in the analogy wherein my letter led to the widespread interpretive disagreement among members of my family, I postulated that this entailed, number one, that I was not an optimal communicator, and number two, that I had not done what's necessary to guarantee that my message had been sufficiently received. Does it not appear to be the case that these inferences are further applicable to the case of the Christian God? Even more so, given that God has many more resources at his disposal. Assuming the Christian God has indeed propagated a message, and given the reality of the prevalence of religious confusion, is it not most reasonable to infer that, number one, the Christian God is not an optimal communicator, and number two, that the Christian God has not done what's necessary to guarantee his message is optimally received? Let's survey Proposition 2, which I personally find quite easy to justify. To postulate that the Christian God has not done what's necessary to guarantee his message is optimally received entails the further proposition that the Christian God could have improved the transmission of his message so as to guarantee more, or even all, individuals would clearly know the message. The pertinent questions then are, could the Christian God have improved how his divine message was propagated, and would this have resulted in more individuals having knowledge of the message? To answer these questions, let's examine the modes and methods the Christian God supposedly did employ in transmitting his crucial divine revelation. The Christian God's supposed divine message is transmitted through a book written 2,000 years ago in the Iron Age in classical antiquity by a plethora of fallible human authors. A book written in dead languages that need to be professionally studied to be sufficiently interpreted. A book that in so many ways appears indistinguishable from its primitive neighbors. A book with no originals that we have access to and with no copies early enough to know for certain what's been altered and what hasn't. A book that harbors so many cryptic and obscure verses, narratives, parables, and pericopes that it becomes altogether difficult to know what exactly the original authors meant and intended. Is one really to believe that there's not anything that can be improved here? Couldn't the Bible itself be much less ambiguous in a multitude of significant passages? Couldn't we have access to the original documents to ensure the Bible we have now is the Bible as it was originally written? Couldn't God have done much more to distance the Bible from the mistaken and primitive cultures of its time? Couldn't God have miraculously provided his word already inerrantly translated in different languages? Couldn't God have just penned the book himself, much like he etched the 10 Commandments in stone? That way the fallibility of human writers would be a non-issue. Surely any one of these actions, and even some of them taken in conjunction, on the part of God would significantly reduce religious confusion and result in more individuals having knowledge of the divine message. This appears to be an entirely reasonable supposition. And these possible actions just mentioned on the part of God are merely a handful of ways to improve the Bible as it stands. But giving the issue more thought, A book like the Bible that bears divine revelation isn't even the optimal way to transmit a message in the first place, especially from an omnipotent being. God could propagate his message in any number of unambiguous ways so as to guarantee the message is cleanly received and clearly known. God could transmit the message himself like he supposedly transmitted messages to various prophets in the Old Testament. Or he could send a divine messenger like he supposedly transmitted messages to various individuals in the Old Testament. Surely God is not restricted in his amount of divine bandwidth. He could clearly and unmistakably write his message in the sky for all to see. Or God could simply hardwire his divine revelation innately into our consciousness so that we would intuitively and indubitably have knowledge of it. Again, surely any one of these possibilities would significantly diminish religious confusion and would result in a vast increase of individuals harboring knowledge of God's divine message. Any of the courses of action mentioned would assuredly raise knowledge of God's message to levels significantly higher than they currently are. Based on all this, it appears as if Proposition 2, which we postulated earlier, is true. That is to say, we've seen that there are numerous avenues that God could have taken that would have significantly improved the transmission of his message. The current state of religious confusion and disarray could have been avoided had God taken the necessary steps to ensure that the potential for confusion was reduced as much as possible. And this has not been accomplished. And this appears to lead us to the justification of Proposition 2 that the Christian God has not done what's necessary to guarantee his message is optimally received. And this further entails that Proposition 1 is true as well, since an optimal communicator, if they want their message to be received, will do what's necessary to ensure their communication leads to the least amount of confusion possible. What we have here, then, is a strong abductive argument against the existence of the Christian God. The supposition of the Christian God who has a message to transmit to his creation, who desires all to be saved, and who is not the author of confusion, most assuredly does not fit the reality of what we witness. The amount of religious confusion and diversity displayed, even within religious sects themselves, would appear to make much more sense on a worldview where there is no divine communicator, no message from a personal omnipotent being who desires to save our souls. Now, of course, Christian apologists have no doubt wrestled with the argument from religious confusion and have, in response, constructed a few rejoinders. Let's survey the potential responses. One response is that from human fallibility. This response places widespread religious confusion not at the feet of God, but at the feet of humans. We as humans are prone to misinterpret, misconstrue, and altogether obfuscate according to our own biases and presuppositions. Thus, religious confusion is not God's fault, it's our fault. Now, while it's true that humans are prone to error in interpretation and understanding, this doesn't seem to absolve God of communicatory malpractice. Recall the analogy with my family. Even if one wants to posit that the members of my family are dismal interpreters and can easily contaminate what they hear or read with their own beliefs and interpretations, there remains much on my part that should have been improved in my communication. First and foremost, there seems to be no need whatsoever to transmit my message via a medium that invites obscurity and ambiguity. Why write a letter when I can simply deliver the message in person and clear up any confusion myself? And of course, I would want to do this in the first place if my message were so dire and my family's lives and well-being depended upon it. Thus, no matter how poor the human condition regarding interpretation, God is easily powerful enough and wise enough to circumvent our fallible disposition. Surely he knows better avenues to instill knowledge into his creation than by a 2,000-year-old primitive book mired in obscurities and a lack of definitive intent. Surely God's omnipotent hands are not so tied by the creation he created. More than this, as we already surveyed, Christian adherents themselves have not overcome the problem of religious confusion. They can't agree on exactly what tenets and doctrines form the bedrock of God's message, nor can they even agree on what exactly comprises God's message, i.e. the biblical canon, in the first place. And Christians are the demographic who invest so much time and energy reading the supposed divinely authored book. They pray and meditate on it and are supposedly guided by the Holy Spirit, and yet they themselves can come to no unified agreement. Surely the effect of their religious confusion is not simultaneously placed at their own feet. This apologetic response, then, appears uncompelling. The second response that a Christian apologist might put forward in opposition to the argument from religious confusion is that of self-deception. This response cites the well-known passage in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 21 that state the following: "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and injustice of those who, by their injustice, suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. Ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been seen and understood through the things God has made. So they are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless hearts were darkened." This response, then, is similar to the first response we surveyed regarding human fallibility, in that it places the blame for religious confusion on humanity, not on God. However, this response is unique in that it postulates that religious confusion is not necessarily the result of unintentional human fallibility, but rather is the result of humans rejecting the truth of God that they already harbor knowledge of. Thus, on this response, God has indeed sufficiently transmitted adequate knowledge to all of humanity, but the majority of humans have suppressed this knowledge and have become futile in their thinking and darkened in their hearts. In my opinion, this response is only promulgated by the most low-level apologists. It's an all too comforting narrative to simply believe as a Christian that those who happen to disagree with you are all self-deceived truth deniers. It's a bit too convenient, is it not? Nevertheless, what can be said in response? Well, I maintain that any person with any modicum of experience with individuals outside the Christian lifestyle will understand how ridiculous and implausible this notion is. In my personal experience, I've encountered devout Muslims, Mormons, Jews, and Hindus, all religious adherents genuinely attempting to bring themselves closer to the divine in order to maintain some form of a genuine relationship. Take, for example, an individual who was born into a strict Mormon culture. They attend a Mormon church all their life. Everything they're taught, everything they experience is shaped through a Mormon lens. They grow to become a devout Mormon missionary who has given their life to their God. They display a fervent love for serving this God, and they proselytize on behalf of their faith. Is it really reasonable to view this individual through the shallow lens of Romans 1? Is this person really spiritually antagonistic towards God? Have they really known in their heart of hearts that the Christian God is the one true God, but instead have suppressed this truth through a darkened heart? I'm sorry, but I just find this wholly incredulous. Isn't it much more plausible and intellectually prudent to infer that this individual holds the religious beliefs they do because this is merely how they've been indoctrinated and taught to serve God all their life through no fault of their own? If they're truly serving the wrong God, are they not still doing this out of a servant's heart? Is their misplaced faith not still genuine faith? I maintain that Christians playing armchair psychologists like this based on a few verses from a 2,000-year-old book, the very book that has caused the religious confusion under discussion, are not putting forward a cogent case that convincingly accounts for the reality of religious confusion. This apologetic response, then, is inadequate. The third and last response, and in my experience the most typical retort that a Christian apologist might construct to account for religious diversity, is the old adage that God works in mysterious ways. Yes, God desires all to come to knowledge of his message of salvation and redemption, and has put into practice the act of attempting to communicate these truths. And yes, despite God's desire, we still observe widespread religious disorder and diversity. But, so the response goes, God must have a reason for allowing such a state of affairs. God's ways are not our ways, and what seems to us to be a glaring inconsistency between how we believe reality should have played out given certain facts about God, and how reality has in fact played out, does not entail that there does indeed exist such an inconsistency. God no doubt has knowledge that we do not, and must have allowed religious confusion to exist to the extent that it has for reasons that elude us as finite beings in a created order. Now, I admit that this response is valid. No one can really claim that God does not have some possible reason that, because of his superior epistemic position, evades our limited perspective. Nevertheless, this response only really carries any weight if one considers that the argument from religious confusion is a logically deductive argument. If the argument is deductive, then all the Christian would need to do is erect one possible scenario wherein the apparent inconsistency between God's act of transmitting a message and religious confusion can coexist. Introducing some theoretical reason that God, due to his omniscience, might harbor successfully accomplishes this. Nevertheless, the argument from religious confusion is not deductive, but abductive. It's an argument that hypothesizes how we would expect the world to look if God had a dire message to propagate and reveal to his creation. Because reality does not plausibly fit into this hypothesis, then we have good reason to believe that the assumption the hypothesis is based on, a personal, loving, and omnipotent God who has a message to transmit to us, is false. So with this in mind, the apologist's platitude about God working in mysterious ways doesn't apply all that much force to the argument. It provides a possible explanation for the inconsistency we observe, but it doesn't make this possibility a plausibility. And seeing as how the platitude that God works in mysterious ways tends to always be, when all else fails, an apologist's last refuge, it really doesn't amount to much in my estimation. This apologetic response, then, also does not seem to diminish the force of the argument. Thus, we see that the pervasive religious confusion surrounding the Christian God's supposed divine message, as transmitted through the Bible, presents a compelling case against the notion of this omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent deity who desires all to know and follow his message. If the all-powerful Christian God truly intended to deliver a clear, universal message, the myriad of ways he could have ensured its unambiguous reception stand in stark contrast to the current reality of religious disarray. The widespread religious diversity and interpretive chaos align more coherently with the world absent a divine communicator intent on universal salvation. Thus, the argument from religious confusion offers a robust abductive challenge to the existence of the Christian God, suggesting that the reality we observe is far more consistent with a world where no such divine message and no such divine messenger exists. Thanks for watching.